Yonasan's arms-bearer saw that a divine spirit had entered Yonasan, and he told his master, "Do all that your heart and mind incline you to do. I am with you in whatever you choose." Yonasan replies to him, "We are going over to those men and will reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Stay still until we reach you,' then we shall stand where we are and shall not ascend to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we shall go up. For the Almighty has given them over into our hands, and that will be the sign." Episode 2, The War Against the Philistines. In the last episode, we saw the appearance and the choice, by both the Almighty and by the Jewish people, of the first king of Israel, King Shaul of the tribe of Binyamin. The coronation of the king came with stern warnings by the prophet Shmuel that the real guarantor of prosperity would not be the king himself, but rather his and the people's adherence to the eternal covenant between the Jewish people and the Almighty. Now, King Shaul returns to his ancestral homes, splitting his time between his hilltop home in Givat Binyamin, the hill of Benjamin, Beis El, and Michmas. Shaul keeps a total of 300 soldiers with him. This is a relatively small force, and he splits it between his residence at Michmas, keeping 2,000 troops there, and 1,000 soldiers under the command of his son Yonasan in Givat Binyamin. The rest of the people he sends home. His plan is to spend at least a year building his rule in peace before contemplating any kind of warfare to secure the borders of his kingdom. A king, like the builder of a new house, or one who plants a vineyard, or a newly married groom, is entitled to a year of relative tranquility to focus on his new position after being anointed as the king. So too King Shaul was hoping for such tranquility. But heaven had different plans, and those plans involved the Philistines, in the original Hebrew, the Plishtim. As mentioned in the previous episode, the Plishtim were a seafaring, coast-dwelling pagan people related to the Carthaginians and to the Greeks. These ancient people, which some identify with the Phoenicians, were practitioners of cruel forms of idol worship, including human sacrifices to the Baal. The Philistines were occupying the coastal plain that was promised by the Almighty to the children of Israel, and they were collecting taxes, heavy taxes, from the Israelites under their military rule. And so it was almost inevitable that the two peoples were on a collision course. But things are about to get much worse. Much, much worse for the children of Israel in their relations with the Plishtim. Shaul has 3 sons. One of them, who commands Shaul's troops at Givat Binyamin, Yonasan, decides to attack the Plishtim. In this, Yonasan has not consulted his father, King Shaul, at all. Instead, in an act of sheer bravery, Yonasan takes his arms-bearer with him alone, and he decides to go to the station of the tax collector and single-handedly attacks that post. And in the process, the local Plishti tax collector is killed. The Plishtim waste no time in reacting to what they perceived as a provocation. They gather their armed forces, one of the most powerful in that region. The number of their troops is over 30,000 in war chariots, 6,000 cavalry, and, relates the account, so many foot soldiers that they were like the sand in the sea, beyond any ability to count. This massive force of Plishtim assembles at Michmas, facing Shaul at his residence. There, as mentioned, Shaul has only 2,000 men. Shaul quickly blows the ram's horn, the shofar, in a desperate call for the people of Israel to take arms and join him. It is clear that war is upon him. But seeing the sheer number and overwhelming force gathered against King Shaul at Michmas, The very opposite of an Israelite mobilization occurs. Instead, panic seizes the people. They cry out to Shaul in dismay. The people residing at his residence in Michmas hide wherever they can, in caves and in the fields and in the mountains. Contingents of the tribe of Gad actually recross to the far side of the Jordan, absconding from danger rather than joining the king's army. Even the soldiers around the king see their force diminished. Many of them promptly desert, choosing discretion as the better part of valor. In the end, the king is left with only 600 men around him. Meanwhile, throughout the land of Israel, the Plishtim consolidate their rule over the Jews to prevent any thought of war among their Jewish subjects, as the Plishtim see them. The Plishtim authorities issue a decree on penalty of death that the Jews must bring their weapons and even metal farm implements to the Plishtim with the purpose of ensuring that a disarmed and thus totally subjugated Jewish population without any access or right to bear arms will not dare to rebel against them. The Jews comply, with no intervention by the king, who felt himself in no position to attack the superior force besieging him. Shaul retreats to the far side of Michmas, away from the view of the Plishtim, so that they should not see how weak he truly is there, and realize that he is an apparently easier target than they thought. And where, King Shaul wonders, where, oh where, is the prophet Shmuel, who anointed him as king only 6 short days before? Shmuel had promised to meet Shaul within 7 days. Yet the body of 71 Dayanim, or judges of Israel, charged with determining matters of life and death and of war, the Sanhedrin, has told Shaul to bring the burnt offering that is the precursor to going to war. So Shaul is stuck between a rock and a tight place. He has been put into that position by the hand of the Almighty. On the one hand, as king of Israel, Shaul is bound to obey the Sanhedrin. They have told him to bring the elevation offering. On the other hand, Shmuel has warned Shaul not to undertake any major action until Shmuel returns. And when Shmuel returns, Shaul knows, Shmuel will bring with him the prophecy that Shaul yearns for. In this hour of great threat and national emergency, prophetic instructions on how the king should proceed. By now, it has already become midday on the 7th day after Shmuel's departure, and now midday has come and gone. Where is the prophet Shmuel? He has not come. Shaul thinks to himself, is not the majority of the day passing as though the whole day has passed? Shaul decides to do as he has been bidden by the Sanhedrin. But rather than going to war, he will only take the initial preparatory step, he thinks, of bringing the burnt offerings and peace offerings on an altar that he has built for those purposes, on the basis of the instruction of the Sanhedrin. Even without Shmuel's return, Shaul believes, reasons, that this is not a major action, and therefore will not transgress the prophet Shmuel's instructions. After all, thinks Shaul, he is not going to war, only bringing offerings to the Almighty in preparation for war. He does so, and as he returns from the altar, he sees Shmuel himself approaching. And Shaul feels his heart rise at the return of this prophet of the divine will. But the king, Shaul, is in for more than he has bargained for. Vayomer Shmuel, Me asisa, Vayomer Shaul, Ki raisi, Ki nafatz ha'am מעלי, ואתה לא באת למועד הימים, ופלישתים נאספים מכמש. Shmuel said, what have you done? Shaul replied, I saw the people leaving me and dispersing. You had not come at the time that was set, and the Philistines had gathered at Michmas. I thought the Plishtim would march down against me at Gilgal before I had entreated the Almighty. So I forced myself to present the burnt offering. Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul, Niskalta, לא שמרת את מצוות השם אלוקיך אשר ציווך כי אתה הכין השם את ממלכתך el Israel ad olam. Shmuel answered Shaul, "You acted foolishly in not keeping the commandments that the Almighty laid upon you. Otherwise the Almighty would have established your dynasty over Israel forever. But now," says Shmuel, "your dynasty will not endure. The Almighty will seek out a man after his own heart, and the Almighty will appoint him ruler over his people, because you did not abide by what the Almighty had commanded you." And so, with this single act, Shaul has determined the course of his kingship, which is ultimately doomed to be wrested away from him. This occurred because as the Jewish king, and indeed as a Jew in general, Shaul is expected to adhere to the will of the Almighty fully and without any unauthorized improvisation. This was not a gray area. Shmuel had told him to wait until his arrival a week later before taking any significant action. The fact that 6.5 days had passed was thus irrelevant, in contrast to the contemporary point of view that often puts the individual ego at the center of the universe, the world of individualism. The Torah put the Almighty at the center of the universe as the true expression of the individual will to be found in the divine will. It is the divine will that separates the righteous from the evildoer. It is a highly exacting test, one that requires a deep faith in the Almighty and deep humility in oneself and one's own ego. And the test was one that Shaul in this case failed, because he did not heed Shmuel's instructions to the letter. As leader of the nation, Shaul's failure was fatal. Yet as at the time that Shmuel admonished the Jewish people for wanting a king, this time too Shmuel does not abandon Shaul. On the contrary, he accompanies Shaul to Givat Binyamin, to Shaul's son Yonasan, because errors do not lead to abandonment in the relationship between the divine and the Jewish people, the eternal covenant. At Givat Binyamin, the king counts his troops and finds that out of a previous 3,000 troops, only 1/5 remain between Shaul himself and his son Yonasan. Barely 600 men have remained by their side. Shaul lays low, for he has no substantial army, and the Jewish people have been disarmed and intimidated. They are in no position to wage war on their enemies, the Plishtim. Yet not so, once again, in the case of Yonasan, the son of Shaul. Once again, moved by a divine spirit of heroism, Shaul's son Yonasan takes his arms bearer and spies across a valley between two mountains, a garrison of Plishtim, part of the larger force camped farther off, across a ravine or gorge overlooking Michmas. He tells the young man, who is his arms bearer, "Let us go and cross over to the Plishti garrison on that side." He does not tell Shaul, his father, anything of this plan. Shaul was then dwelling as far as he could from the side of the Plishtim on the other side of Givat Binyamin, because he did not want them to realize that all that remained to him were 600 men. Achiyah, the son of Achituv, the brother of Ichavod, the son of Pinchas, the son of Eli, who was the Kohen Gadol in Shiloh at that time, wearing the ephod, and the people as well, knew nothing of Yonasan going towards the Plishtim. There were two tall, tooth-like outcrops of rock between Yonasan and the Plishti garrison, one facing Michmas and the other outcrop facing Givat Binyamin. Yonasan's arms bearer saw that a divine spirit had entered Yonasan, and he told his master, "Do all that your heart and mind incline you to do. I am with you in whatever you choose." Yonasan replies to him, "We are going over to those men and will reveal ourselves to them. If they say to us, 'Stay still until we reach you,' then we shall stand where we are and shall not ascend to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' then we shall go up, for the Almighty has given them over into our hands, and that will be the sign." And the two of them revealed themselves to the Plishti garrison, and the Plishtim said, "Look, Hebrews are coming out of their holes where they were hiding." And the men of the garrison answered Yonasan and his arms bearer, saying, "Come up, and we'll tell you something." At this Yonasan said to his arms bearer, "Come up after me, for the Almighty has given them over into the hands of Israel this day." Miraculously, he and his arms-bearer leap over the gorge and the protruding tooth of rock, and the Plishtim fall before them. And the first blow that Yonasan and his arms-bearer strike fells about 20 men in a narrow area. And there was a great terror in the camp, in the field, and among all the men of the garrison, and the Plishti raiders in the larger camp also trembled, and a tremor occurred in the earth, and there was a great terror before the Almighty. And Shaul's scouts on Givat Binyamin saw that the Plishtim were melting away and scattering. And Shaul told his men who were with him, "Take a roll of the troops and see who from our camp has gone." And they did so, and found that Yonasan and his arms-bearer were missing. The king ordered the Kohen Gadol, Achia, to bring the Ark of the Covenant, and sought to have him consult the Urim and Tumim, the special manner in which the Kohen Gadol can consult the Almighty on crucial questions, such as whether to go to war. But at that moment the tumult grew even greater in the camp, and Shaul told Achia, "Put down your hands," for there was no time amid the increasing row, a sound of ever-growing noise and tumult and battle. And Shaul and the men with him called out to assemble the remaining military men there present for war. And they all rushed into the war, and there the confusion was very great, for the Almighty had confused the Plishtim, and they were smiting one another in the misapprehension that they were smiting the Jews, their enemy. And the Hebrews, who had joined the Plishtim out of fear, then went up out of the surrounding camp to join the small army of Israel, the troops who were together with Shaul and Yonasan. And now those Jews who had joined the Plishtim out of fear were not afraid for their homes and relatives who were under Plishti rule, because they saw that the hand of the Almighty was stretched forth against the Plishtim to fight for Israel. And of the Jewish people who were hiding in the mountain of Ephraim, that the Plishtim had fled, and they attached themselves as well to Shaul and Yonasan's force in the war. And on that day the Almighty saved Israel, and the war raged past the previous front line of the Plishtim, pushing them back into the area of Beis Aven, where the war still raged. Then Shaul issued an order, swearing his troops to obey. The Jews, on penalty of being cursed and upon penalty of death, should not stop even to eat until the Plishtim are vanquished, for fear that the Jewish troops would not pursue their enemies to the full extent possible, but would stop the battle to eat a meal, and so would allow the enemy breathing space to effect a successful retreat. The king's troops obey his order, but as the day wears on, they become increasingly weary and weak with hunger and thirst. When the army comes into a wood where honeycombs are to be found, the king's son Yonasan, who is leading the troops now as before, dips the tip of his staff into a honeycomb and then eats the honey on the tip of the staff. Yonasan feels rejuvenated, energized for battle, and he tells the troops that this was not what his father meant when he called down a curse upon anyone who stopped to eat. But the troops tell him that his father has sworn them all not to touch food until the end of the battle. Yonasan disagrees with them, explaining, in Yonasan's view, that his father had meant not to eat an actual formal meal, where the breaking of bread and attendant food preparation and blessings were required. This honey, Yonatan tells them, far from slowing them down in their pursuit of the Plishtim, will give them the energy to achieve victory without slowing them down, as a proper meal would. The troops follow suit, eating the nourishing honey and then continuing their pursuit of the Plishtim with renewed vigor and strength. The troops pursued the Plishtim until past the border of the tribe of Dan to Alon, in the western region that had been occupied by the Plishtim. There the troops gave way to weariness. They brought peace offerings, shlomim, to the Almighty. But so great was their hunger and their weariness that they failed to first throw the blood onto the sides of the altar, in contravention of the Almighty's commandment regarding peace offerings. This failure to properly throw blood around the altar was reported to King Shaul, and he sent word to the troops not to commit such a sin. Rather, he had a stone rolled there as an altar, and he bade them all bring their animals to slaughter as offerings on that altar, and the king threw the blood as commanded. He inquired further of the Almighty as to what course to take, but was not answered. He deduced from this silence that there was some current sin that the people committed, for, he reasoned, it was not a past sin but a current one, because until now the Almighty had performed miracles in their war against the Plishtim. Shaul caused lots to be drawn between the people on one side, and him and his son Yonasan on the other. The lots fell upon Shaul and his son. So he had further lots drawn between himself and his son, and the lot fell upon Yonasan. Yonasan immediately confessed that he had committed the sin of eating the honey in the forest, contrary to the oath, and urging the troops to do so. He had thought, he explained, that had not been Shaul's intention in the oath. Shaul declared that despite his pivotal and heroic role in the victory against the Plishtim, Yonasan had signed his own death warrant. He declares that his own son will be executed. But the people intercede on his behalf. How can you, they tell the king, execute the hero of the revolt against the Plishtim? The king relents. Yonasan's life is spared. Shaul has shown that he is willing to reverse his decisions when his people oppose those decisions. From today's vantage point, where rulers of countries in the West, at least, are often elected by and beholden to the people who support them, whether by votes or financially, Shaul's reversal of his decision may seem unremarkable, but Shaul's very responsiveness to the will of the people, even reversing previous firmly held decisions, will be an important trait of character that will affect his kingship profoundly. Moreover, despite Shaul's dramatic victory against the Plishtim encamped against him at Michmas, this would be only the beginning of his war against the Plishtim, a war that he inherited and one that has been discussed in detail in previous generations, including most famously the dramatic story of the mighty Samson or Shimshon and the betrayal by his Plishti wife Delilah, and the dramatic miracle of Shimshon's destruction of the Plishti temple. These battles against the Plishtim will rage throughout the rest of the king's life and those of his sons. The story of this battle against the Plishtim goes deeper. What we have discussed until now has been on the level of pshat, or plain meaning, of the story. Yet there is more here than meets the eye. To provide a taste of the dvash tachas halashon, the taste of honey under the tongue, Rabbi David Valli, the student of the Ramchal, the great Italian thinker, answers a question that you may have asked yourselves already. Why is Yonasan going it alone? Why doesn't Yonasan inform his father before engaging in the seemingly foolhardy battles in which he and his arms bearer single-handedly engage a much larger force of Plishtim? And why doesn't that elicit outrage on the part of his father the king? Or at least worry on his part? The answer is that we are talking about higher levels of spirituality, seemingly difficult to square with the natural way in which the world operates and which war is waged. Conventional military wisdom would seem to indicate that numbers are essential to victory, except that under very specific circumstances, such as unequal levels of weaponry, strategy, tactics, or conditions on the field of battle, such as narrow passes, leveling the field for a smaller force against a larger one. Yet here, there seems to be no such inequality. Instead, says Reb David Valli, we are dealing with levels of miracles that Yonasan merited. On the other hand, due to his earlier failure to heed the word of the Almighty, King Shaul no longer merits that level of miracles. The divine spirit rested on Yonasan, and he knew that the power of the Creator of the world was the only essential military advantage that he needed. And so he jumps into battle with seemingly impossible odds, confident of divine assistance, which indeed he receives, and which leads him to victory. King Shaul realizes immediately that this is in fact a higher spiritual reality, and he knows that since his transgression against the Almighty, the spirit of the divine has not rested upon him as it had before. Thus, when he sees his own son Yonasan acting apparently as a lone wolf, impetuously, the king knows that Yonasan is harnessing that spiritual force that is stronger than any earthly force ever known to man. And the king voices no objection at all. In the next episode, it will become clear that the Plishtim are by no means the only external enemies facing King Shaul in the land of Israel. The king is destined to fight further wars against the Moabites, the Tzovites, the Ammonites, and most importantly for his own kingship, the implacable Amalekites. In the next episode, we will meet the Amalekites, providing needed background information on that people who dogged the steps of the Jewish people throughout history. And we will witness King Shaul's showdown with the Amalekite King Agag, as well as a continuation of the fraught relationship between Shmuel, the prophet of the Almighty, and the first king of Israel, Shaul. It was this fraught relationship that will set the stage for the next king of Israel, David, whose life is so important as a historical and spiritual matter that it will be the subject of a number of subsequent episodes of the Kings of Israel podcast.